The realtor had staked a sign at the road that said the quiet part out loud. Not for sale. Just one word somebody had painted by hand and driven into the mud years back and never bothered to pull. Unsellable. Ada Boone pulled it out of the ground with both hands, knocked the dirt off it, and leaned it against her truck like a thing she meant to keep. Behind her, across the road, two men she didn't know yet were watching from a stopped tractor. One of them was Vernon Tuttle, who farmed the dry ground east of the wet 80 and had tried to buy it once, decades ago, only to drain it and given up. "City woman bought the slough," Vernon said to the man beside him, not quite low enough. "Bought standing water and a mailbox. Give her one wet spring and she'll be gone." Ada heard it. She'd have to get used to hearing it. She turned and lifted a hand to them, friendly, because she'd decided on the drive down that she would not fight this county. And then she waded out into the water that everyone said was worthless to start measuring how deep it ran. She was 43 and she was not from there, and both of those things counted against her in a place where your grandfather's name was your credit rating. She talked wrong. She'd come from 3 states off with a paid-off truck, a small inheritance, and a plan nobody would let her finish explaining. The 80 acres she'd bought sat in the low bend of the river bottom and held water most of the year. Real standing water, not a wet patch, a shallow sheet of it across black muck that swallowed a boot to the shin. 6 realtors had refused to list it. The seller had nearly wept when she signed. The county had a name for it that had stuck for 50 years. The swamp. And now the swamp had a fool who'd paid money for it. What none of them knew, watching her wade out that first morning, was that Ada Boone hadn't bought the land in spite of the water. She'd bought it because of the water. She'd learned to see water as a crop instead of a curse from an old man named Sim Delacroix, 3 states south, where she'd spent 11 years working for wages on flooded ground before she ever dreamed of owning any. Sim ran rice, and behind the rice he ran crawfish in the same flooded fields, the one feeding the other, water that a dryland farmer would have cursed doing double duty and paying twice. Sim was gone now, for years, but he'd taught a rootless woman with no land of her own the thing he said about every field he ever flooded. Everybody fights the water. Nobody thinks to hire its star. He'd set it standing knee-deep at dusk with the crawfish traps coming up heavy, and he'd left Ada, when he passed, the one thing he owned worth leaving. A flat-bottomed aluminum pirogue, dented and river-gray, that he'd run his own fields from for 30 years. It rode in the bed of her truck the whole way north. It went where she went. Everybody in that county knew you couldn't farm the swamp, and every one of them was right, if farming meant what it had always meant there. A plow, a dry seedbed, corn or beans in rows. You could not do that on Ada's 80. The water made it impossible. But Ada had no intention of fighting the water for a dryland crop. She meant to grow the 2 crops that require exactly what the county called a defect. A rice that wanted its feet wet, and beneath it, in the same warm flooded acres, the crawfish that fed on the stubble and the muck and came up in traps by the sack. The work was slow, and it looked, to anyone driving past, like a woman making her own ruin worse. She didn't drain. She did the opposite. She spent that first fall building low levees by hand and machine, shaping the sheet of standing water into managed paddies she could flood and hold and lower on purpose, turning an accident of water into a thing with a valve on it. Vernon Tuttle watched her build banks to keep water in and told the coffee counter she'd lost the thread entirely. "Rest of us spend our lives getting water off the ground," he said. "She's out there building it a swimming pool." The doubter with real teeth wasn't Vernon, though. It was Royce Kessler, who ran the farm supply and sat on the drainage district board, and Royce came out in the spring with a clipboard and a grievance dressed as concern. He didn't get down off his running board. "Miss Boone, you're holding water on that bottom. The district's got rules about backing water up near the ditch. Affects your neighbor's drainage." It wasn't quite true and they both half knew it, but it was the kind of thing a board man could make expensive. "Folks around here would take it kindly if you just let that ground be what it is. A swamp. Some ground the good Lord made to stay empty. Some ground the good Lord made to grow rice," Ada said. "I'll keep my water on my own 80, and I'll show you the survey says so." Royce shook his head at her the way the whole county did, and drove off certain the outsider would drown herself in her own foolishness. Ada stood on her new levee and said Sim's line to the standing water. Everybody fights the water. Nobody thinks to hire it asterisk. Then she went and got the rice seed she'd hauled from the south, the long grain that wanted a flooded field, and she planted her first paddy into water 3 inches deep while the whole county waited to laugh. The setback came in the second summer, and it came at the crawfish, which had become the thing she loved most because they were the part nobody believed in at all. The rice had taken. That was the miracle that kept her going through the first winter. Green rice standing in water on ground the county swore was dead. Behind it, in the flooded stubble, she'd stocked crawfish from Sim's own southern stock, and through a warm spring the traps came up heavier every week, and Ada let herself believe. Then a stretch of brutal heat settled over the bottom and the water in her shallow paddies warmed past what crawfish can stand. The oxygen going out of it the way it goes out of water left too warm and too still, and she came down one morning to traps full of dead crawfish and a smell she'd never forget, the whole second crop, the harder, stranger, more valuable half of Sim's system, dying in the heat in front of her. She'd flooded the fields. She'd forgotten that standing water, left alone in high summer, turns against the very thing it's meant to raise. She'd hired the water and then stopped managing it, and it had done what unmanaged water does. That night she sat in Sim's gray pirogue pulled up on the levee, alone, the dead traps stacked beside her, and the old line came back turned against her. Nobody thinks to hire it. She'd hired it, and it had killed her crop, and Vernon Tuttle was right, and Royce Kessler was right, and 6 realtors and 50 years of county wisdom were right, and the outsider had bought a swamp and gotten exactly what a swamp gives. She was 44, 3 states from anyone who'd known her, with a dead second crop and a bank note on standing water. She didn't sleep, but she'd sat in that pirogue enough evenings beside Sim to hear, under the self-pity, the thing he'd have actually said, which was never the water betrayed you but always what did the water teach you, and the water had taught her, plainly. It was not a thing you flooded and forgot. It was a thing you moved. Crawfish died in still warm water because still warm water dies. The fix was to keep it fresh, to flow it, circulate it, drop it and raise it, run it through the paddies instead of trapping it in them. Sim had done exactly that in the deep south heat, and she'd been too proud of her levees to remember why he'd cut his so the water could always move. She changed everything after that. She recut the levees to circulate instead of merely hold, put in a simple recirculating flow so the paddies breathed, lowered the water in the worst heat to concentrate the crawfish where she could keep it cool and moving, and timed the whole dance. Rice up, water down for harvest, water back on for crawfish, the 2 crops trading the same acres across the seasons the way Sim had run it, the water working twice and paying twice. The 3rd year the rice stood thick and the traps came up alive and heavy, and the county, which had watched her fail, now had to watch her not fail, which is harder to forgive. The moment it clicked for everyone came at the first real crawfish harvest. And it clicked because of a thing the county could not argue with, a truck. Ada had found her first customer the honest, unglamorous way. She'd driven 3 hours to a city with a growing appetite for the exact thing nobody grew that far north, and she'd walked into the back doors of restaurants with a cooler, and a chef named Denise had tasted her crawfish and her short-grain rice both and done the math a chef does, which is that fresh and local and impossible to get is worth paying for. Denise placed a standing order and told 2 other kitchens, and by harvest there was a refrigerated truck coming down the county road to the swamp every week, and county roads have long memories for what trucks stop where. The day it clicked, half the county found a reason to be on that road, because the sight of it was something none of them had ever seen and none had thought to imagine. Ada Boone poling Sim's gray pirogue across her own flooded field in the early light, lifting trap after trap heavy with crawfish, sacking them on the levee while a buyer's truck idled and a chef's check waited, 40 acres of standing water. The water that 6 realtors refused to list and Vernon Tuttle swore would run her off in a spring, producing 2 crops off ground that dryland farming called dead. Vernon stopped his tractor at the fence and sat there a long time and didn't say anything at all. He just watched the woman farm the water he'd spent his life trying to get rid of. The numbers, when the county did the arithmetic it loved, were not lottery numbers, and Ada would have laughed at anyone who called them a fortune. But rice off the flooded acres and crawfish off the same acres behind it, and the premium a city chef paid for the only such operation for 200 miles. 2 crops on 1 water, sold fresh into a market nobody local had thought to reach. Put the unsellable 80 into the low 6 figures a year within a few seasons, every dollar of it traceable to a levee, a trap, and a truck. Ground the county had valued at nothing was, acre for acre, out-earning the dry corn around it, which brought Royce Kessler back down the road, board hat in hand. He got off his running board this time. He stood at the levee and watched the traps come up and could not find the rule he'd meant to enforce. "I told you to let that ground be a swamp," he said finally. "You did," Ada said, poling in. "I was trying to run you off my county." "I know it," she stepped out of the pirogue. "Here's what I'd rather. Half these dry bottoms your board fights to drain every spring would grow rice and crawfish better than they grow drowned-out beans. I'll show any farmer here how to do it who wants to learn, your board included. I'd rather this county have a second crop than have one more person tell an outsider what the ground can't do." She let it sit. No edge in it. "I'm not going to hold the sign against you, Royce. Somebody painted unsellable on this land 50 years ago. I'd rather teach the county to read it different than rub anybody's nose in it." Royce didn't have an answer to that but a handshake, which from a board man was nearly an apology. And within 2 years there were 3 more flooded operations in that bottom, one of them Vernon Tuttle's youngest, working ground the family had cursed for 100 years. The good spread the way water spreads. Ada's operation gave steady work to 2 families in a county short on it, and the weekly truck to the city put the county's name on menus 3 hours away for the first time in its life. That was the harvest. The county stopped calling it the swamp. By the next spring they called it Boone's, and the woman who talked wrong and bought standing water had a standing in that bottom she'd earned trap by trap. She kept Sim's gray pirogue running long after she could have bought a better boat, because it was the boat that had taught her to hire the water instead of fight it. And she kept the hand-painted sign, unsellable, but she turned it face in against the barn wall and painted on the back of it, in her own hand, the only correction the land had ever needed. Some evenings she'd pole out across the flooded rice at dusk, the traps coming up heavy the way they'd come up heavy for Sim 3 states south, and she'd say his line out loud to the water that had made her, once, and fed her in the end. Everybody fights the water. Nobody thinks to hire its star. 50 years the county had fought that water and called the fight a swamp. Ada Boone had simply stopped fighting and put the water to work, and it had turned out that the flaw everyone ran from was the whole fortune, waiting on the one person willing to stand in it long enough to see. If you've ever bought or been handed the thing everyone else swore was worthless, and seen the use in it they couldn't, tell us about it in the comments. We read them all. The moral runs shallow and clear as a flooded paddy. What one person calls a defect is only a use nobody's found yet, and the ground everybody writes off is often just waiting for someone who refuses to farm it the way it's always been farmed. Patience isn't sitting still. It's standing in the water long enough to learn what it wants to grow. Tell us where you're listening from tonight, and about the person who taught you to see a use where everyone else saw a loss. If the story reached you, share it with someone standing at the edge of their own swamp, wondering. And whatever waterlogged, written-off ground is yours to work right now, may you have the patience to stop fighting it, the wit to put it to work, and the quiet joy, one evening, of poling out across the very thing they swore would sink you.